This is Chapter 9, the chapter on monopoly. There are two fun parts about this chapter. First, we're going to develop the revenue model in a much richer way than we did under perfect competition. And we're going to use that revenue model for not just monopoly, but for other non-perfect competition examples. And the second is that monopoly gives us a chance to talk about government regulation at least a little bit, which is sort of interesting in its own right. So monopoly means there's only one firm in an industry. So the economic question is, why is there only one firm? So two interesting possibilities are that the industry is a natural monopoly. That means it's cheapest for one firm to provide the whole market, and that means that there's no room to enter for other firms. And the second possibility is that entry is illegal, which is another interesting thing to think about. But entry is crucial whenever we talk about any non-perfect competition form of industrial organization. And the reason is because if there's big economic profits, we're going to be thinking about entry. Economic profits signal that the firm is making much more money than it could in any other industry, which means it's in a privileged position. And so that means that there's gains from trade that are being lost to the society as a whole. The book spends some time talking about different market-based barriers to entry. So that's going to be important for us, not just in this chapter, but in chapter 10 as well. So this is not just a monopoly chapter. You should just think of this as a richer revenue chapter. The key to how we're going to think about marginal revenue is the demand curve for the firm. In perfect competition, it's horizontal. Marginal revenue equals the price. The firm has no pricing power. In any other situation besides perfect competition, the firm will face a downward sloping demand curve. That's really interesting because if the firm charges all consumers the same price, and we'll get to that assumption in a minute, that means that marginal revenue is going to be less than the price. The reason is because if the firm lowers the price in order to sell another output, it loses revenue from all of their existing customers. So the addition to revenue from the firm is lower than the price it charges the consumer. When the firm makes its output decision, it's going to set output so that marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This means that that marginal cost is less than the price because marginal revenue is less than the price. And that means that there's lost gains from trade. The book shows that graphically in figure 9.1. It does the table to generate that right before it, and it explains why there's this deadweight loss or lost gains from trade. When the demand curve is linear, it provides an easy way to both mathematically and graphically show why marginal revenue is less than the price, which the book does in figure 9.2. Once we've built the revenue market model for the firm, so that's the revenue model means determining how marginal revenue compares to the price, then we're going to proceed just like we did in the perfect competition chapter, right? The firm's going to set output so marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There's some interesting implications, though, when marginal revenue is less than the price, because there's these deadweight losses or lost gains from trade. Both the governments and the firms want to capture those deadweight losses. The government does because it's trying to help the society maximize its utility by getting as many gains from trade as possible. The firms want to do it because they're trying to make more money. When there's a natural monopoly, which is when one firm serves the whole market, that means there is deadweight loss. And then the question is, how can the government help get some of those deadweight losses? So we'll spend the last part of this chapter talking about government regulation, essentially setting a price ceiling on the firm, and the consequences of that. It turns out it's a very difficult problem to solve, and on average, we've not been very successful. The government's tried some other things like antitrust, but that works poorly when there's natural monopolies. The other aspect of government interference is that sometimes we create monopolies on purpose. So, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, the government allows firms to get a patent. With a patent, a firm has a monopoly. That allows it to make economic profits, but not forever. As we all know, those patents expire and then generic drug makers come in and the marginal cost is very low and the prices become very low. Well, when the price is high, in other words, when the patent exists, there's a lot of consumers that don't get the drugs that would like to have them. Now, that's a social problem, and there's lots of implications about national health care policy. But it's a way to really emphasize this lost gains from trade. At the same time, without the monopoly profits that a patent gives, the firms don't have any incentive to undertake the research and development expenditures necessary to develop a new drug. So these are the trade-offs that are faced. And they're interesting to talk about, and you want to have a good understanding of that. Then in Chapter 10, we're going to talk more about how the private sector tries to create downward sloping demand curves.